My name is Lance Witt, and I lead a ministry called Replenish. And the focus of my ministry is helping people live and lead from a healthy soul. And I'm excited that City Changers is embracing this topic of living from a healthy soul. You see, self-leadership is critical to being able to live out God's purpose for your life. In this series, you're going to be equipped and empowered to impact your community in meaningful ways. As we dive into this topic, I want to share with you a key principle, and here it is. Self-care is not selfish. It is good stewardship. You caring well for the one and only life you've been given is foundational for a life of kingdom impact. And one of the aspects of good soul care and self-care is the rhythm and pace of your life. So to set the stage, let me share a brief story with you. One day, my son Jonathan came to me and said, "Dad, I know she's the one." And I'll never forget that special conversation he and I had that day. It was the day that my son Jonathan let me know that he wanted to get engaged to the girl that he'd been dating, and her name was Ryan. Their very first date had been playing golf together, so he decided that he would propose to her on the 18th hole of that same golf course. He and his friend Josh devised a creative plan. First, they took a golf ball, cut it in half, and hollowed it out, and then they placed her engagement ring inside the golf ball and put it back together. On the outside of the golf ball, with a black marker, Jonathan wrote what would be her future initials, RW. It was Josh's job to hide in the trees near the 18th hole and then to drop the ball in the hole and video the proposal. Now, it's sort of hard for Josh to hide anywhere since he's 6'10". But as they got to the 18th hole, when Ryan wasn't looking, Josh ran onto the green and dropped that special golf ball into the hole. Well, when Jonathan and Ryan got to the 18th green, Jonathan sort of lagged back so that Ryan would have to go over to the hole and pull the flag. And when she went to pull the flag, she noticed a golf ball laying in the hole. She picked it up and saw her initials on the golf ball. And Jonathan took that golf ball, got down on one knee, took out the engagement ring, and asked her to marry him. Now, here's why I tell you that story. Inside that random golf ball was a gift that would forever change her life. And inside what I always saw as a random Old Testament teaching is a gift that has forever changed my life. And this talk is built on a foundational and fundamental premise. You cannot live life at warp speed without warping your soul. And if you were around me very long, you would discover I don't like the word balance. Everywhere we go these days, we hear about living a life of balance. And when I hear someone talk about living a life of balance, I picture life sort of in a way that all the areas of my life are working in perfect harmony. But to be honest, I don't think I've ever had a moment of balance in my entire life. I can't think of a single moment when every area in my life was working smoothly. But the word rhythm portrays something very different. Rhythm is a choice I make. Rhythm allows for busy seasons and for the unexpected to come into my life. And there is a God-ordained rhythm that will allow us to live and lead from a healthy soul. That God-ordained rhythm for your life is this: work and then rest. Produce and then restore. Go hard, but then stop. Empty your bucket, but then fill and replenish your bucket. Noah Ben-Shea writes and says, "It's the space between the notes that makes the music." The same thing is true for our life. We must have space or rhythm between the notes of the busyness of our lives that demands so much from us, and that's the only way we're going to make a life that God designed for us. Yet we live in a world that is unfriendly to a healthy rhythm of life. The speed of life continues to accelerate. We have 24/7 access to most everything. Therefore, we have more options and opportunities coming our way and less time to make decisions about them. Did you know that 57% of workers have vacation time left at the end of the year? It's kind of crazy, isn't it? You would think that a guy who called Replenish would have this issue tamed in his life. And I wish that were the case, but it's just not so. For as long as I can remember, I've been a hurrier. Sometimes I'll be walking down the street with my wife and I look up and she's 3 steps behind me. And in a rather frustrated voice, she'll say to me, "Are you going to walk with me or in front of me?" And what I want to say is, if you would hurry up, I'll walk with you. But 42 years of marriage has taught me some restraint. So I just apologize and try to slow down. But whether I'm waiting in line at the airport, listening to a long, drawn-out story, or sitting at a traffic light, I find myself muttering those often repeated 5 words that are a sign of my battle with rhythm. Could you please hurry up? The truth is, I don't just have a hurried step, I have a hurried spirit. Hurry is more than just what's going on around you. It's about also what's going on inside of you. I hurry not so much because of the external demand, but often because of the internal drive. As I heard John Ortberg say once, hurry is not about a disordered schedule, it is about a disordered heart. And I think he's right. Gradually, I've been learning that speed and intimacy do not make good partners. I can't have a deep, connected relationship with my wife and always be in a hurry. And what is true in my marriage is also true in my relationship with God. When you run fast and hard and long, eventually you will drain your soul. You won't really notice it for a while, but you'll wake up one day and you'll be emotionally empty and spiritually dry. And life will become hard and frustrating. Team members that you work with will get on your nerves more than usual. It's not a fun place to live. And what I've learned is that running on empty will eventually lead to one of 3 things: cynicism, disillusionment, or burnout. And I just want to tell you, you are not the exception. God hardwired rhythm into the entire universe. We live in a universe defined by rhythm, and as you sit here today, you breathe in rhythm. The average person inhales and exhales 15 to 16 times per minute. Your heart beats with a very predictable rhythm, and when you go to get an EKG done, it is to measure the electrical rhythm of your heart. Think about it. The tide comes in and goes out with a sense of rhythm. Much of the beauty of music is tied to rhythm. Farmers have a rhythm of planting and growing and harvesting. Interestingly, in Leviticus 25, God gave the command that even the land was to have rhythm, that it was to be given a Sabbath every 7 years. Even the physical dirt needs a break. Nothing that God made was made to constantly produce. Everything God ever created needs rest and restoration. And you, my friend, are not exempt from that law of the universe. You were made to live in rhythm. And if you violate this principle long enough, you will pay a price. When you ignore a healthy rhythm of life, you end up doing violence to your body, your soul, your relationships, your emotions, and especially your walk with God. A life of rhythm is a deliberate choice that I have to own. As you well know, there's always more that can be done and needs to be done. The needs of life will always outpace the capacity that you have. But you can choose a rhythm that declares, even though there's still more to do, I'm going to choose to stop and rest and replenish. Jesus modeled this so well for us. He regularly took time to live in a healthy rhythm of work, but then also embracing rest. In Mark chapter 1, Jesus is in the city of Capernaum, and he has an incredibly busy day of ministry. He's the guest preacher in the local synagogue that morning, and during the service that day, he's confronted by demons. Now, that had to be an intense and draining moment. Not only does he preach and deal with the demons, but he also heals people. And after church that day, the Bible says that Jesus goes over to Peter's house for lunch. And while he's there, he heals Peter's mother-in-law. And before he wraps up his day of ministry, the Bible says that the people in town brought everybody who was sick and demon-possessed to Jesus' door. And so before he puts his head on the pillow that night, he heals more people and he casts out more demons. Now that is a full day. And in verse 35 of Mark 1, it says this: very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up and he left the house. Now, if you just read the first part of that verse, you might think to yourself, well, he is, after all, the Son of God. He probably should get up earlier than everyone else. He only has 3 years to launch this revolutionary movement called Christianity, so he's probably heading off to another busy day of preaching and healing and casting out demons. But the last part of verse 35 says, he went off to a solitary place where he prayed. He deliberately chose a rhythm that allowed for space and quiet and time to just be with his Father. And unlike you, Jesus lived at a time in history when slow was built into the fabric of daily life. Lack of electricity, technology, transportation, all of that forced life to be slower. Think about it. Before the invention of cars and planes and email and smartphones, life was less frenetic. But you and I, we live in a very different world. So we must be more intentional, even more proactive about a life of rhythm that allows for space and rest. Well, I've got great news for you. God has actually given us a very practical, tangible strategy for helping us live a life of rhythm. And one of God's strategies for a life of rhythm is this practice called Sabbath. Now, I'm not sure what your church or theological background is, but I grew up in a time and in a church where Sabbath was a total non-issue. I mean, I knew it was one of the 10 Commandments, but I just assumed it was one of those Old Testament things that we didn't do anymore. So for the first 30 years of my Christian life, the concept of Sabbath wasn't even on my spiritual radar. I never heard a sermon on it, never read an article about Sabbath. I just assumed it was one of those things we just didn't practice in modern times. Also, I didn't personally know one person who practiced Sabbath. And my philosophy of life would have had no room for it. I mean, after all, I had a calling. I'm a leader. And that kind of calling demands sacrifice. And life is short and the needs around me are urgent. And I have to squeeze all I can out of every second of every minute. And I used to have this mindset that I'll just rest when I get to heaven. But the truth is, that's an exhausting way to live. So in recent years, as I've been on a journey to live from a healthy soul, I have spent a lot of time studying what the Bible says about Sabbath and rhythm. The concept of Sabbath traces its way all the way back to creation. In fact, the word Sabbath, not a deeply theological word, just means to stop. After God completed the work of creating the universe, he stopped and rested on the seventh day. He moves from creation to reflection. Now, he certainly didn't stop because he was worn out from 6 days of creating. He rested to model for us this principle of rhythm. This seventh day, that day of rest, was so important that God blessed it and declared it holy. Did you know that the first thing that the Bible ever declares holy was not an object or a place or a person, but it was a period of time, a 24-hour period called Sabbath? The model God gave us was work hard and then unplug hard. Now, get this. God values hard work. He wants us to be productive, but he made us with limits. You have limited time, energy, and resources. And one of the keys to a long, rich, fruitful life and a life of impact is to learn to live within our limits. I have spent most of my life acting as though I didn't have limits. Well, when we go to Exodus chapter 20, we find that God anchors the command of Sabbath to creation. He says, in my creation of the universe, I modeled for you this principle of rhythm. Work, then rest. Produce, then stop. And then in Exodus 20, verse 11, he says, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and everything in them, but on the seventh day he rested. That's why the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and set it apart as holy. I love that verse 11 says God blesses the Sabbath day. It's not just holy, it's not sacred only, but it's also blessed. God infused the Sabbath day with blessings. Now, if you were to go over to Deuteronomy chapter 5, where the 10 commandments are listed again, there's a subtle change that takes place when the Lord talks about Sabbath. In fact, in verse 15 of Deuteronomy chapter 5, God says, remember that you once were slaves in Egypt, but the Lord your God brought you out with his strong hand and powerful arm. That's why the Lord your God has commanded you to rest on the Sabbath day. So here's the question. What does Sabbath keeping have to do with the Israelites being slaves in Egypt? There's actually a very powerful truth in this verse. Instead of anchoring Sabbath in creation, now the Lord anchors it in relationship. One of the things that makes God's people different is they stop. When they were slaves in Egypt, there was no day off, no rest, no vacation, no downtime. But now as God delivers them and they're under the rulership of God and not the tyranny of Pharaoh, he wants them to know that rest and stopping is part of his divine design. I think there's an even deeper lesson that God was wanting them to learn, and here it is. Their value to him was not just in what they could produce. Their value was in relationship. Let that sink in for a moment. Even when I'm not working and I'm not producing on a Sabbath, I am just as valuable to God as when I am working. That's a lesson I've spent the last decade really trying to absorb and believe in my soul. Now, I can hear some of you saying, okay, Lance, I get it. The Sabbath was one of God's top 10 list in the 10 commandments, but what does the New Testament teach about Sabbath? In fact, when I read through the Gospels, it seems like Jesus is always getting in trouble for violating the Sabbath. The Jews had gone to great lengths to try and interpret the command of Sabbath. And so to help God out, they established all kinds of specific laws to define what was work and what wasn't work. So when you read the stories found in the Gospels, Jesus wasn't really violating the spirit of the Sabbath, but rather all these arbitrary rules that religious leaders had established. But nowhere in the Gospels do we ever read that Jesus took the 10 commandments down to 9. Here's the main thing Jesus taught. Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Now here's my loose paraphrase of Jesus' response. God gave you Sabbath as a gift, and you guys have totally messed this up. You took what God intended as a blessing, and now you've turned it into a religious burden. If you haven't done so already, I want to challenge you to study this topic of Sabbath for yourself. Take some time and work through the passages on Sabbath, because here's my conviction. Without a biblical, deep sense of conviction about this issue of Sabbath, the gravitational pull of busyness will always win in your life. The Jews have this wonderful tradition that symbolizes the practical impact of Sabbath. It's called Havdalah. At the beginning of the Sabbath, you would light a candle, and that candle was to be a reminder to you that this day is different than the other 6 days. This is a day that is not about work and it's not about productivity. It is about rest and relationship, both with God and with others. And when the 24 hours of Sabbath was completed, the Jews would take that candle and they would extinguish it in a cup of wine. And when they would pour a little bit of that wine into a saucer, here was the symbolism. That if they would practice Sabbath well, that it would spill over into the rest of their week, and they would be a better person the other 6 days because they practiced Sabbath on the seventh day. Well, let me take these last few moments, and I want to get really practical with you. You need a plan to have a healthy rhythm of life. So let me take a couple of minutes and talk with you about a framework that I've been using in helping me practice Sabbath. Now, it won't look the same for all of us because all of us are wired differently and we're in different seasons of our life. But these 5 words will help you figure out what Sabbath looks like for you personally and for your family. So here's the first one. Prepare. It takes some work to get ready not to work. You might have to do some things ahead of time so that you can actually unplug. But there are 2 things that I've done that have been extremely helpful in helping me prepare for Sabbath. Number 1 is get it on your calendar. If you were to look at my calendar for the next year out, there is 1 day out of every 7 days that is designated as a Sabbath. The second thing I would tell you is don't call it Sabbath. Don't call it just a day off. Call it Sabbath. The word Sabbath means something very different than a day off because for most of us, a day off is just work of a different kind. So number 1 is prepare. Number 2, stop. What would it look like for you to stop from working and producing and accomplishing for 24 hours? To stop from this impulsive and compulsive need to accomplish and produce. So prepare. Stop. The third word is rest. Not just physical rest, although some of us could certainly benefit from a nap or more sleep, but I think it's also this idea of being at rest, internally and externally. Now, I don't think this means you sit on your couch for 24 hours and do nothing when it's a Sabbath, but I do think it's a day to slow down, to have a more restful day, not compulsively busy. And for some of us, we might need to have a serious conversation with our spouse or a good friend or our family about the pace of our lives. What would it look like for you to create space to rest? All right, let me give you a 4th word. It's the word delight. Isaiah 58 talks about enjoying and delighting in Sabbath. Here's a question I like to ask leaders. What is life-giving to you? I remember one day sitting in a large gathering with Mark Miller. He's a vice president of a major corporation in America. And as he did his talk, he said, when you were born, God gave each of you a palette of colors with which to paint an amazingly beautiful and rich life. He said, you know what my problem is with most of you? Most of you only paint your life with one color, the work color. And God has so much more for you. And wow, that just hit me because for so many years of my life, all I did was work. So what is it that you have in your life that delights you, that replenishes you, that is an outside hobby or recreation that you're involved in? All right, let me give you one final word. It's the word worship. The Bible talks about Sabbath being a Sabbath unto the Lord. Sabbath is not just a day to replenish from a hard week. It's one of God's strategies to make sure that we stay connected with Him. So Sabbath should include time for worship, for lingering over God's word, for unhurried times of prayer, for reflection and gratitude. Let it be a day where you feel deeply connected to God. Well, let me tell you a little story to illustrate this. So I grew up in a place in the United States. It's kind of high desert, and we would only get snow a handful of times a year. But I remember that when the forecast was called for snow and I would wake up early in the morning, I would go over to my window, pull back the curtain, and if our front yard was covered with snow and the street was covered with snow, the next thing I did is I ran into the den, turned on the TV, because way back in the day, the way they let you know if schools were closed is they would put it across the bottom of the TV, and I would just wait for it and wait for it and wait for it. And then there it would be, Osuna Elementary closed. It was a snow day. And my mom was great about snow days. We never had to do homework or extra chores. A snow day was to do anything that we wanted to do. Can I tell you something? Every 7 days, God has given you permission to have a snow day. So how about it? Can I just challenge you to get started? Even if it is just one morning a week or a half a day a week. And it could take you a while, it did for me, to learn how to actually slow down your soul and truly enjoy this gift called Sabbath and rest. But I promise you, it is worth the effort. May God give you all the grace and tenacity and commitment you need to pursue a life of rhythm.
For more information, visit citychanger.org.